Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the activities of our centre. And I'm joined today by our friend and frequent podcast collaborator, Jacob Rennaker, who is a story expert and sits over in Seattle, I believe. So we've got the transatlantic perspective here. And this is an episode that Jacob and I have been planning for some time. So, Jacob, do you want to make the announcement of what we're talking about?
Yes, so we're going to be talking about, and we're going to try to subdue our just over-the-top excitement for this, which is the letters of JRR Tolkien, the revised and expanded edition that came last year.
Just so you can see why it's taken us a while to plan, is how big it is. So it's quite a bit of reading, though we should start out by saying that, so I was reading, making notes, Jacob, but I think you took a different tack, didn't you?
Yeah, I listened to the audiobook version, which is just shy of 30 hours of listening time, but it was worth every minute of it. Yeah, so it's a completely different experience. So I'll be interested to hear your experience. Mine in the listening, the narrators were phenomenal. They have, so in the book, there's kind of a preface to each of the letters to provide some historical context. Then the letters themselves, and then footnotes. And the way that they handle this in the audiobook is they have kind of your third person narrator, a single narrator that's doing all of the introductory matter and footnotes, and then or after notes, because Tolkien sometimes footnotes his own letters, of course, because he's Tolkien. But when Tolkien is writing, they have a separate narrator who does this. And just the warmth, the voice that they chose to narrate Tolkien, it just made me feel like it made these letters feel so incredibly personal, to have that kind of through line here. Like I was sitting down and listening to him like dictate these letters. So it was a really great experience. So if you've read it, I think there's something to be gained from listening to the letters, because there were several instances that he mentioned, especially toward the end of his life, where sometimes he would dictate some of the letters that he was doing. So having some of that more kind of like the oral feel, being there in the room with him, was kind of a sense that I got. Like I was kind of peeking over his shoulder as he was writing these, kind of listening in on his kind of internal conversations that he was having. So it was really fun.
Excellent. So we'll put a link to the audio version. Is it the Sam West team? Yeah. So the narrators are a well-known sort of theatrical family here in the UK. And they have done some of the other less famous Tolkien books. So the voices might be familiar to those who have bought other Tolkien narrations, other than the Andy Serkis ones, of course. Anyway, so we're breaking this down because we've got a life in letters, which is clearly a big subject. So we're going to first of all give our impression of the overall effect of reading these letters. Is he a good letter writer? What's it like? Is it boring? Is it informative? Those kind of big picture questions. Then we're going to talk about the following. First of all, about Tolkien's views on his own creativity and his own world. Then we're going to move on to looking how he looks at the world through his Middle-earth. And that's particularly fascinating. And we'll then move into the sort of the life elements, things like relationships with his children, his views on politics, moving into relationship with nature and spirituality, and then a roundup at the end, a ragbag of things like his adventures in publishing and the film industry, and his frustrations with academia, sort of little bits and bobs which are recurring themes. Okay, so let's start with what you learn from the letters. Are they a good read or a good listen? I would say yes. They are some of the best letters that I have come across, having read many, many literary collections of letters when I was doing my doctorate. someone like Jane Austen, who I imagine was a very entertaining letter writer, the letters that were not destroyed by the family are, they're very thin in what they allowed to remain, because we think that probably a lot of the most interesting stuff was burnt in an attempt to kind of tidy up her reputation, which is such a shame. But maybe that's what I'd want for my own, my own sort of stuff I might regret later. But so reading Jane Austen's letters are rewarding, but they're not as fun as reading Tolkien's letters. I've also just been reading William Wordsworth's letters. And while they're good and interesting, they're also very full of himself. There's a real sort of sense of Wordsworth ego, which he's famous for. So I think that I like Tolkien an awful lot through reading his letters and getting a sense of just how chatty he is, even with people writing to him out of the blue.
Yeah, agreed. I think, he's very self-deprecating, like sometimes perhaps to a fault in some of these letters, but not across the board. Because when he's passionate about something, he gets very passionate, and his writing really expands in on that. And so I think, it's really fun. He clearly thinks these things through, thinks everything that he's doing through. And so so it's really interesting, like you said, Julia, to kind of see his mind working. You can see the gears turning, and this life in letters. This is essentially his biography. The closest thing is one of the things it mentions in the introduction is this is kind of the closest thing that we have to an autobiography of Tolkien is just the collection of letters that he wrote himself. So I absolutely agree that they're engaging. I mean, because even the ones that are the letters that are just talking about apologizing for not getting his manuscripts in on time, even those are kind of demonstrating kind of the struggles, because he's very apologetic and saying, I'm having this and this kind of come up, and so thank you for your patience. You see him getting frustrated at certain points, which we'll talk about later when we talk about publishing and film. But really just kind of seeing the emotional range that is here, this kind of like thoughtful. It's thoughtful across the board, but then being able to see the emotional range and emotional coloring that these letters kind of provide to him as a person was something that was really meaningful and I think fascinating for me.
I think they're very comparable to C.S. Lewis's letters, which are also wonderful letters. And both of them often take a moment to reflect on both themselves and what they're writing. So you get a huge amount of insights in an autobiographical way. So if someone went to my emails, they'd get a really random, it wouldn't amount to anything as elegant or as thoughtful as these. The art of letter writing, where you're actually composing something which isn't as ephemeral as an email, which you send off in 2 seconds. It really shows. I think they're both of them are excellent letter writers. Right. So let's go to the phases. So in terms of who is he writing to? Well, obviously he doesn't write to people very much who he's living with. So there's only a couple of letters to his wife because he's living with his wife. So why would he be writing to her? And some of his closer friends who he is seeing all the time, he rarely writes to as well, because that is a one-on-one conversation. And you might be getting references to a conversation he has had with, say, Charles Williams or C.S. Lewis. But mostly the correspondents are outside of Oxford. So that's the sort of the feel of it. And they go through the phases match his career. So the first chunk is the rising academic who has started doing this writing, and the publication of The Hobbit, and then the beginnings to come up with a sequel. During the war, the majority of the letters, or the best letters really, are the ones where he's writing to his son, Christopher. And there's a lot about Lord of the Rings in those. And then after that, once the Lord of the Rings, this is skipping ahead quite quickly, but then there is a sort of much broader category of people he's writing to. After that, there are fans writing in, there are publishers, there are people who are about to sort of read and review his work. There's a very interesting letter to W.H. Auden, for example, So the latter half of the book, when Lord of the Rings is published, it doesn't tail off. It even up to pretty much his dying day, there are interesting letters being read reflecting on what he's published and what he thinks of it and how it's being received. So let's, first of all, what did you learn most in it about the actual Middle-earth project or the Legendarium? Because it's more than just Middle-earth, of course. What were your most insightful moments when you were reading the letters?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the statements that really struck me was that he said that in retrospect, much of my own book puzzles me.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah. And it's interesting because shortly there, I'm just going to go through to my notes on that, because one of the things is you see that he's thinking about themes and they go over more than one letter. So there will be that. He'll say that, then goes on to say, even in a mythical age, there must be some enigmas, as there always are. Tom Bombadil is one intentionally. So it's almost as if he's really happy not to know everything about his own work. And he also says that it's like he's discovering it rather than making it up.
Yes. And he mentioned something similar about the Ents specifically, right? That he said that that the Ents surprised him, that he had no intention of putting them in, but as he was writing, they kind of appeared. And he said it felt like he was just reporting at that point. He wasn't constructing. And then he goes into at that point, where he thought that Ents came from. But somebody was asking, it was a fan that was asking him about the Entwives, whether or not they think that the Ents found the Entwives. And he's very, honest and saying, I don't know. I would presume that perhaps they did. I think maybe they didn't, but he didn't have that constructed. So that's sort of like humility about his own world, that there were things that are kind of like developing, percolating, that he hadn't fully realized. He was circumspect about what he said, but then there were some points. There was something else I noticed when he's talking about his own world, when he goes on this excursus for, I don't know how long it was in page length, but it felt like it went on for a good 6 hours, not quite 6 hours, but it's very long, on the birthday customs of hobbits and the development of birthday gift giving. Somebody had a question about Smeagol and Deagle and the ring being considered a gift, when later it says that that the hobbits actually instead of receiving gifts, they gave gifts on their birthdays. And so he had this whole big detailed outline of historically how those customs would have changed based on where they were and how it's happening. So there are some things that he really could drill down on that he had thought about and felt confident about, but there were other parts like Tom Bombadil, like the Ents, where he was more willing to leave those as more as mysteries and kind of open-ended in his own mind, which is fascinating from a storytelling perspective.
Yeah, and also the other thing you get from the letters, particularly the ones written in the 40s to Christopher, is that you feel as though you're sitting with him composing it. It's wonderful. It's just some of the best bits are where he's got this moment where he says to his son, a new character has come on the scene. I am sure I did not invent him. I did not even want him, though I like him. But there he came, walking into the woods of Ithilien, Faramir, the brother of Boromir. And I think that tone captures exactly how he's writing for a majority of the time. It's this sort of wonder at his own fertile imagination, just coming up with what characters like Faramir. And later on, he says, of all the characters, I'm most like Faramir. So a character who turns out to be a real reflection of his own inner self is something, a serendipity. It just happened to come. And I know from my own writing that when I'm not comparing myself as to his level of craftsmanship, but the things I enjoy most as a writer are the moments where my story seems to be running itself And characters do surprise you. They do walk out the woods like Faramir does in that bit. So I would, if you love Lord of the Rings, you will not be put off or disappointed by reading the letters. It's not like seeing behind the curtain. You're going to have a Wizard of Oz experience, that it gets smaller. I think not. I think it's almost the opposite. It gets bigger.
Absolutely. You definitely get a sense that there's so much more that Tolkien didn't put in, that he, for editorial purposes and trying to, hone this down to a pure story, there was so much that he had to cut from just all of the other thought that he had put into each of these characters. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more that you get. It does, as expansive as Lord of the Rings feels, right? It's one of the comments comparing Lord of the Rings to a lot of other more contemporary fictions, that the depth of world building, it really feels like this is a world and there's so much that's happening outside of the pages. As much as that is the case for the book itself, it's also the case for what was not included in the book, right? So for Tolkien, but there's so much more. He's not just giving you the illusion of there being more that exists for this story. It actually exists in his head. And so this is really truly an immersive world. He has immersed himself in this story, and it seems to kind of like permeate him and his mind and his thoughts. And we'll talk about that.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now it's the final days of our Everything's on Sale event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses. Our Memorial Day event ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life's sleep.
Maybe that might be a good segue for talking about how he sees our world, kind of his framework for dealing with Lord of the Rings. He kind of sees that as a lens for viewing our own world rather than vice versa. Yeah. So what were your thoughts, Julia, on Tolkien kind of integrating Middle Earth thought and approaches to how he describes our own contemporary world, his own contemporary world?
Well, the thing that I sort of maybe hadn't focused on, because when I've been reading about Tolkien lately, it tended to be in the context of the Inklings. So this has really reset my understanding of his creativity, because I think far more important was the family context. And he does actually say at one point to Christopher that more and more he comes to see he's writing it for Christopher Tolkien. And it means that within the family, it's a shared family story. So that when he's looking for ways to express his feelings about the war, he's using the common story that he's been sharing. So there are two big themes. One is describing war as orcs and the sort of, in fact, you see this today being used in the sort of Ukraine-Russia conflict, don't you? But he was already using it in the Second World War. But not just about the enemy as being like the sort of the evil. He's not very keen on Hitler. I can say that. We should probably quote that, because it's he calls him a sort of ruddy little horrible little man, doesn't he? He doesn't normally swear, and ruddy is obviously a mild swear word, but he lets, for Tolkien, that's like both barrels. So it's not just that. He also talks about the common room experience, so of the officers' mess, and how Christopher might be experiencing a sort of, I don't know, laddish culture, maybe, reading between the lines, that perhaps people were not behaving in ways that his Tolkien thought was honourable or well-behaved or polite. And so he would talk about that using the language of the orcs and Uruk-hai behaviour for things that Christopher is experiencing in outside the enemy territory. And then it makes him think about his own experienced during the First World War, and he often links back to that. So from what Christopher's going through, there's a sort of a combination of, oh, this is when I first thought of all of this, was when I was in various army huts or even in the trenches, I think he says at one point, coming up with this way of escape. So he's definitely got this lens of understanding war through the fiction he's sharing with his son. But he also uses it to talk about the way we're treating nature. And that particularly comes up once the war context is gone. It's the sort of uglifying of the countryside and the rise of the machine. So what else did you see about the way he used his own story to explain the world he was in?
Yeah, that's really interesting, your insight on Lord of the Rings or Middle Earth kind of being a family story, at least especially with Christopher, right? So he in one of the letters he says when Christopher is at war out in the field, he says, I wish that I can't remember exactly what he was talking about, but he says, I wish that it might be written in runes beyond the craft of Celebrimbor of Holland, shining like silver, filled with visions and horizons that fill my mind. So he's speaking poetically, but he's bringing the elements, the symbols of Middle Earth into his own personal expression, right? So this is a very personal expression to his son, and he's drawing on not Shakespeare, not existing, pre-existing stories at this point. Although he does frequently throw in, Middle English or early, Old English quotes, just throws in there without translating them, right? Of course, that are meant to evoke certain ideas that are best expressed in that language itself. And so there are certain things that, because Tolkien is developing this, that he can best express his own feelings in the language of Middle Earth. So like that's one of them. Yeah, the war, when he's talking about World War II and the hydrogen bomb, where he says, we're attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. Right, it's this kind of analogy. And now other people say like, well, is the ring an allegory for nuclear bombs? And he says, no, it's not. This shows it's the opposite direction, right? So you're seeing the contemporary setting, and he's telling the story, and then he's using the language of that story to then compare and contrast to the contemporary situation. Not, this is kind of a one-to-one. So yeah, talking about war, and he even at one point, this is really charming, right? When he in a letter to Christopher, he referred to his typewriter as a Mordor gadget.
Yeah.
That he says that he will forgive it if it brings letters to Christopher. So he didn't so he's like this, machinery. He would prefer to handwrite, but if he could type faster and get more out to Christopher, he was willing to do this. So I think that was really charming that he's seeing these big ideas and filtering his own experience through this painstaking work that he's put into building this world. So that was, so I really like your insight about this being kind of a shared language with which he could describe. And you're right that he doesn't talk about that in letters outside to his family. Like, so to letters to his publishers, he wouldn't necessarily use that same language as heavily, but he certainly does invoke it more and say, like, at the very end of his life, after Edith's death, he compares his grief and situation to the Baron and Luthien story in one of his letters. I can't remember who that letter was to, but throughout his life, this wasn't just while he was in the thick of writing these stories that he's making these kind of connections, but it's after he's written it, long after he's written it. These are still stories and ideas that are still, part of his psyche, and that he's using to illustrate and communicate his kind of innermost feelings.
And just to show how rich it is, because he's a brilliant prose writer as well. You get this basically the upshot of what we're saying is, everybody go away and read these letters. That is what we highly recommend you do. So I was talking about, so he's writing to Christopher. He's not only using the language of the heart with Christopher is the shared story. It's a way, and then he goes on to think, well, why does fantasy work in a situation where we're both have faced death? Him in the First World War and Christopher at risk in the Second World War. And he says very interestingly that writing is a relief of feelings to rationalize it and prevent it from just festering. In my case, it generated Morgoth and the History of the Gnomes. That's the very early version of this. Lots of the early parts of which, and the languages discarded or absorbed, were done in grimy canteens, at lectures in cold fogs, in huts full of blasphemy and smut, or by candlelight in bell tents, even some down in dugouts under shell fire. Oh, it's just so brilliant. That last part, you just have a image of this young soldier just disappearing into his world under the most horrendous of situations. And he's sharing this with his son. And this is where I think perhaps it's worth talking about. We don't see some of the relationships with, so like Priscilla, who stays in Oxford mainly, there's not many letters to her at all. I think there's perhaps 2 or 3 very sort of functional letters. Doesn't mean they don't have a close relationship. It's just not being mediated by letter. But then you also get the letters to his other son, Michael, which make an interesting contrast to the ones to Christopher. So Michael, I think, has a more difficult relationship with his father, and he's having a more difficult experience of growing up. And you get to see Tolkien feeling that he's been a failure as a father. And there's a heartrending letter where he does say that. He says, I don't think I talk to you enough. But he does send his son quite long letters about religion and finding solace in faith in a way that it seems like a very good father to me. But he's his. So you do get the sense of the difference between Tolkien. Obviously, Christopher was the son who was very much on his wavelength and shared in the project. And Michael inevitably isn't Christopher and was having his own difficulties. So that's quite an interesting insight to the pain of parenthood that Tolkien, when you can't quite solve your child's problems and you don't always approve of what they're doing, because he'd fallen in love with someone and they thought it was all a bit fast. So you do get a little insight of what's going on in the family behind all of this.
Yeah, that was great. That was good seeing there. I definitely saw that with the letters to his children where he's saying, pray for me, or I attended mass for you. You definitely get that kind of personal touch that's woven into the different letters to his children, that fatherly concern, kind of a spiritual stewardship that he felt for his children. And so this, he's saying, if you're able to, please attend mass, right? So he's still, after the children have left home, because it's something that's so deeply meaningful for him. And at some point, like you said, he says how, attending mass is something that's like helping him work through his disappointments, frustrations, and pain. Then he is encouraging that in his children in some of those letters. So that was really touching to see, like, kind of the fatherly concern for them in all of their areas of life, but including the kind of the religious, kind of spiritual life. He definitely brings that up in different letters.
The Tolkien lecture, the Tolkien 50 lecture series has just had a guest appearance by Michael's son, another Tolkien family. And I think you got the impression there that it was difficult being the grandson of someone famous, and it was even more difficult being the son of someone famous. Because I think Tolkien's view is quite a traditional view of Catholicism. So if you, even old-fashioned within Catholicism. So I think if you weren't quite following in those footsteps, it was quite tricky. And that was so once some of the choices being made there, I think, added to a sense of distance. But there is a lovely letter on faith, letter 54, written, because the letters, they've retained the lettering numbering from the first edition of the letters. And any new letters they've given sort of 54A and so on, so that you can still read across if you come across a reference in critical works about Tolkien. But he writes a lovely letter to Christopher about angels. I'm not sure angels aren't something I often think about, but clearly they're a big part of Tolkien's mental furniture, because he talks about Gandalf being like a guardian angel. And he says angels are not a plump lady with swan wings. Good, I'm glad to hear that. But the bright point of power where that lifeline, that spiritual umbilical cord touches, there is our angel, facing two ways to God behind us in the direction we cannot see, and to us. I've never written anything as beautiful as that to my children. Sorry, kids. But I thought, isn't that a beautiful thing to write to somebody? And so those letters to Christopher are a real high point. I think he goes on pretty soon afterwards, the next letter, to have a joke about C.S. Lewis being called an ascetic. Because apparently when he started doing his, C.S. Lewis started doing his theology, people were calling him ascetic. And he said, that's not the Lewis I know. He put away 3 pints in a very short session we had this morning and said he was going short for Lent. So the opposite of ascetic. So it's the sense of humor and the twinkle in the eye keeps coming through, as well as these moments of sort of spiritual reflection. I also thought that he was very this is a little bit more connected to where we started talking about what we learn about Middle-earth, is he often thinks about the motives of his characters in a way here, which I found really illuminating, particularly and it links to spirituality, hence what led me to think of this, is he really does consider Gollum to have almost repented. And he said it's just a careless word from Sam that sets him back into his unrepentant Gollum. And he talks about the difference between Sam and Frodo. He says Sam's more interesting. Frodo, because he has to be high-minded, is less interesting. And Sam is actually one of the characters he really sort of separates out and talks about almost more than any other character in a way. Thinking about where the name came from, about who he was based on, the servants during the First World War, and so on. So it seems as though Sam, in a way, is the heart of Middle-earth, or the Hobbit part of Middle-earth for him. Did you get that impression? Does that come through when you were listening to it?
I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, at least certainly there are questions that I remember that fans had about or other people recognizing there was somebody else whose name was Sam Gamgee, and talking about that and how he developed that character and where the name came from, the inspiration. But yeah, that's he definitely brought up I remember on several different occasions where he does bring up that point that Gollum was near repentant if it weren't for a careless word, and he brought that up in several different places. So it's clearly something that wasn't just kind of a passing idea for Tolkien, but that was clearly something that he kept thinking about and felt that he needed to keep sharing. So definitely the idea of really kind of inhabiting the emotional lives of the characters. Mm-hmm. So much so that he could give in one of the later letters where he's talking about Frodo's failing. Somebody's asking, like, why did Frodo fail? Was that a failure? Yeah. Was that a moral failure on Frodo's part? He then uses that to talk about morality, about grace, and then kind of in the same letter, lengthy letter about whether or not Frodo was good or bad for having kind of fallen apart at the end and not being able to just throw the ring into Mordor. Or into Mount Doom while he was in Mordor. He gives glimpses into what could have been. So he said, if Gollum would have had the ring and possessed it, here's what probably would have happened. If Frodo would have kept the ring and lived, here's what probably would have happened. And if Gandalf would have taken the ring, here's what probably would have happened to Gandalf and how he would have developed. So he's thought through, and I was just so impressed by that he's given so much thought into the motivations, desires, needs and wants of each of these characters, that he could plug in another one of these characters. It's like, okay, you want to say what would have happened? Here's what would have happened, because here's what Gollum uses to make decisions. Here's what Gandalf uses to make decisions. So just he knew so thoroughly each of these characters. That was so impressive to me that he'd given that much thought, that it was so, I think, easy. I don't know how easy it was, but it seemed, at least it came across as a kind of effortless in this particular letter. It was a letter 246, where he kind of then outlines then what all of the different possible trajectories, kind of these alternate endings that you could have had for the ring, that he could do that. And he seemed fairly confident, but yet he was still kind of circumspect in saying, I can't say for sure this is what it would have happened, but it seems likely that this would have happened. To be able to talk in that way, of that level of understanding, just kind of demonstrated to me the care and respect he had for the characters that he was creating.
Yeah, and just if you're talking about letter 246, I like letter 244, which does a deep dive into Éowyn and Faramir. So you see what we're saying? There's so much more. We all want more Tolkien, but there is so much more here. So moving on to what we don't like. Okay, so as much as Tolkien is clearly someone I adore his writings, what have you, there are moments in the letters where I don't like him very much. And I have to remind myself he is a man of a certain age writing at a certain time. And the area I struggle most with is his writing letters about women. And if you wish to skip over this letter when you're reading it, perhaps that's one way if you would have a problem about it like I did. 38A. There is something good about it. Let me talk about what's good about this letter. Is basically, this is where Michael's having his one where he says he wants to marry someone who they think it's all too quick. Clearly in the background, Edith has sent him Michael a letter, which has been a bit like that angry email you send and you regret. It's not gone down well. And Tolkien is coming in and trying to tidy it up and mend the family, hurt about this. But he does make some terrible sweeping comments about women being not able to understand their own feelings. But on the other hand, he does mention that Edith is going through the menopause, the change of life. And I thought, actually, that's quite advanced for a man of that era to actually be able to be upfront with his son about female biology is quite advanced. So I kind of thought, okay, I'll let it pass. But that was the moment where I thought, yeah, I feel the period in which you're writing Tolkien, and I feel the gap. Most of the time I feel on his side, but there I was chucked out of my little fandom into thinking, oh dear, that's not quite so enlightened, is it? C.S. Lewis does similar things, by the way. So it is, I think, the era they're in where they probably knew less about women outside their own family, and so judged a lot of people on the basis of how they're feeling about their wife at the moment. Is there anything else that you found that, so we're not giving just a flattering portrait, was there things about this that revealed a more gritty or the warts and all aspect to a letter writer?
Yeah, that's good. Good explanation on that letter. And that one he does. And there's some interesting stuff where he's talking about marriage, right? That gives him an opportunity to kind of outline his theology, his philosophy and theology of marriage. Which there are some bright spots in there and other spots that don't age well.
That letter 43 has a very good thing, which is, but the real soulmate is the one you were actually married to.
Right. Yeah. When he says that this is fascinating, right? He says, like, nearly everyone makes a mistake in who they marry, and it cannot be otherwise. Most don't know any better. Right. So like, it was like most of us, he says, like, if we would have like been older and learned more and understood more about ourselves, he supposes that most of us would actually pick somebody different, once we have a better sense of like self-understanding. But he says, the point is to like make that work. And that really reminded me of Leaf by Niggle, right? It's kind of like quasi autobiographical work where at the very end, our Niggle has just been annoyed so much by all of the, neighbors who are asking for things from him. different responsibilities. All he wants to do is just to paint a tree. He wants to paint not even trees, just like leaves, because that's the only thing that he's good at. But then his neighbor keeps interrupting him. They both die. He's kind of resentful towards the neighbor. They both die. They kind of encounter each other in a sort of afterlife. And the neighbor apologizes, to him, says, "I wish things, would have been different." And then, Nigel says, "They could have been different, but they couldn't have been better." And so this idea of that Tolkien brings into the legendarium, that even more Melkor's greatest attempts at pain of like trying to wrench the plan of Eru Ilúvatar to try to do damage to that, something greater is able to weave that into something more beautiful than it would have been if that kind of tragedy or violence hadn't happened in the first place. So all of these things kind of, I think I see them kind of like crisscrossing, coalescing as kind of this kind of constellation of ideas in Tolkien's mind, that there's something there that you can, that there's something larger that can unify and bring certain points together. And I think maybe that's how I approached Tolkien's letters, recognizing that there were some of these things that were, like I said, in the Nigel, Leaf by Nigel, that Nigel is so bothered by the community that's asking him for help, that he's clearly, Tolkien gets grumpy about being interrupted for working on this. And we see it, writing as, in a sense, in some senses, as like a luxury, right? He just wanted to write. He's a man that just wanted to make up languages and develop them and just write stories, but he couldn't. And so he's constantly frustrated by his job that was paying the bills at the time.
Quite adorable, right? Really, isn't it? His annoying professorship.
He's so annoyed. He just like wants all of this to go away, even though it's what's providing the money for his family to survive. You can tell that the health, Edith's health is taking a toll on him. He doesn't come out outright and say like, "This is really frustrating. I feel like it's holding me back from what I want to do." But kind of like reading between the lines, you get this tension that like he says like, "I want to write, but I had to take care of Edith. I know I had this deadline, but I had to take care of Edith." And he clearly sees that as a responsibility, but it wasn't a joyful, magical responsibility that he has. It wasn't this kind of romantic idea in the classical sense of love and marriage. It was this reality of age and the long defeat, really. I think that's, you can kind of see that illustrated in his constant frustration all the way through the end of his life, that he wants to do more, but like things keep going and slowing down, and he recognizes that he can't do as much as he could, and he's sad about that. So you kind of see personally reflected this long defeat as he wants to write this beautiful, sweeping, myth, but he's constantly curtailed at every turn, and he just kind of is squeaking things out and trying, knowing, then fully embracing that like, I'm never going to be able to do all of this. And there's a sense of kind of like sorrow that kind of pervades, especially I think some of the later letters in that sense.
Yes. So I think just to sort of refine the comment about his job, it's not so much the academic research side of it and the language side, it's the marking, which he had to undertake.
Specifically the marking, yes, the exams. Yeah, that although he did have, there were individuals, he would talk about school meetings and just like his disdain for some of these faculty meetings that he had to sit and be a part of, and some snipes that he would make at different faculty members. But again, for him, that was in the context of, for some people, that was their entire world was academia, and that's how they made their identity. For him, his identity, I feel like, was as storyteller and as kind of a chronicler of Middle Earth. That's where he seemed to receive his sense of personal fulfillment and self-worth, was through that. And so to the point that those other things got in the way of that and affected that, he was bothered by them, and perhaps disproportionately. But from within his context, it was his kind of sacred responsibility was to write and develop Middle Earth. And then if anything that got in the way with that was evil in a sense. He never says it's evil, but it bothers him, and he reacts sometimes, I think, disproportionately
Yeah, so you get a sense of this is where you have to just you're meeting a full person, a grumpy, frustrated. You're meeting him. He can be a bit snappy, a bit curt, but that's all the rich texture of human life.
Right.
And obviously, sometimes he'll be writing to get it off his chest as well. So writing is therapy. So I'm not passing judgment. I'm just aware of the historical gap between our generation and his, and we're not cancelling him. Don't worry.
Right? No, not at all.
It's just the sort of awareness that, and also these were private letters, of course. Let's not forget that he had. These were not for me to sit and read. It was him trying to advise his son. So let's moving on from that. So we're beginning to touch on his adventures in publishing and latterly in film. I think some really interesting letters. There's that feeling of we know the end of the story and he doesn't. And there are several moments when he says things like, "I'm afraid I've made a great mistake in making my sequel too long and too complicated and too slow in coming out. It is a curse having the epic temperament in an overcrowded age devoted to snappy bits." He'd definitely hate Gay, wouldn't he? And you're saying, no, keep going, don't give up. It's almost, if you could take away the knowledge that it actually all does have a happy ending, he does publish. There is some nail-biting moments where you're thinking he's not going to finish. He's losing the will to complete it, and that's where you get the idea that C.S. Lewis is saying, "Come on, Tollers, you got to finish this." And obviously having to write it for Christopher, so Christopher gets to see what happens at the end. So it's quite exciting to see how the actual writing gets done.
Yeah, you see one of the interesting comments that he made early on, kind of to kind of presage all of that, is that he felt that as he was trying to come up with a sequel to The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit. So you see The Hobbit, like how it develops, how it was received, and his, it seems like genuine surprise that more than 20 people were actually interested in The Hobbit. So he's getting money from it as well, which is really helping his family situation, which he brings up over and over again is, we're struggling financially. So clearly finances were something that, I don't know exactly what his finances were, but for him, it seemed to be a weight, kind of a fairly constant weight, that he didn't feel like he had enough, and he was struggling to make ends meet with his family. But kind of before that, as The Hobbit is, increasing in popularity and sales, and his, publishers are asking him, "Can you write a sequel to this because it's being so well received?" And they could smell money. He said that he was struggling to conceive a sequel to The Hobbit because he, quote, had squandered all of his favorite themes, motifs, characters on The Hobbit, and was afraid that there wasn't enough left for a meaningful sequel to The Hobbit, right? So seeing that, now seeing Lord of the Rings and everything that spawned, right? You're like, that seems like how ridiculous is that? But that's something he really felt, that he just put so much into The Hobbit, of just, all his favorite ideas, right? Kind of like motifs, characters, themes, which is, I think, really interesting as an author, for writers, for all the creatives that are listening, right? That I think there's a tendency to reserve your best ideas and be sparing with what you do. Tolkien had, but he wasn't, planning in the long term for this. He just put everything into The Hobbit. And then when he was asked for a sequel, said, "Oh dear, I put all of my ideas into The Hobbit. How can I possibly do this?" But then as he was thinking and sitting with it and having the ideas, the intersection of The Hobbit and how that could connect to the larger legendarium, that's when things started firing, and he started coming up with even greater ideas, a grander scope and of characters, of themes. So I think that's really telling. You kind of see him as in artistic crisis there, working through that personally, is what can he commit to writing a sequel to The Hobbit? Because at that point, he thought that was the best, he'd put everything in that he had to give personally for what he liked and actually wanted to write. But then in sitting with it and exploring it more, that gave rise to even larger ideas that he hadn't considered possible in the first place. So that was really interesting, seeing his doubt about his ability to write anything, and then just kind of a lesson, kind of a creative lesson that, yes, put everything that you have into the project that you're doing right now, spare nothing, make it the greatest thing ever, and like trusting that you can do something even better. As good of the ideas that you have right now, even better things can grow out of that if you're taking this work seriously.
Yeah, and the other thing, sort of in sort of thinking back as what almost happened, is that he kept sort of saying, "Oh, here I've got this thing called the Silmarillion," or it wasn't. Right. How about this? And everyone kept saying, "Well, not sure it's commercial, Mr. Tolkien." And it also, I hadn't realised how close he'd come to not publishing with Rayner Unwin with Lord of the Rings. They were sitting on it for a long time, and he started talking to another publisher who seemed to potentially be interested in doing the Silmarillion as well. And that sort of the alternative history that he decided to go with that publisher and went first with the Silmarillion. What would the world have made of that? Would they have even got as far as reading Lord of the Rings? It's quite fascinating how it almost happened. And he did use the interest from the other publisher to actually get Unwin to finally commit to publishing. So that was quite interesting, watching him managing his publishers. There are a lot of those letters. And it looks like a lot of the expanded, the additional letters are, it seemed to me, at least percentage wise as I was listening, it seemed like there are an awful lot of them that are the newer letters, are some of these shorter letters that were to the publisher. So you get to see more of his editorial interaction than you would have seen in the original letters compilation. Those are some of the ones that were trimmed out, but you definitely see him struggling, wrestling with, he wants the Silmarillion published. But that Julia, that's a fantastic thought experiment, right? If he would have gone with the other publisher and published Silmarillion first, would people have gotten to the Lord of the Rings, or would the sale of Lord of the Rings, if people just would have given up on him after that? Because it seems like now the easier point of entry, popularly at least, for a broader audience, is Lord of the Rings, because it's an engaging story with characters, full characterization. It's a full narrative, as opposed to kind of snippets of history, mythology, genealogies and whatnot. So to thinking about what it would have been like, would the fantasy genre in publishing have developed in the same way if Tolkien had not published Lord of the Rings first? That's one of the things that he's talking about. He said, he mentions, it seems like with this, he says, I'm not doing anything new and groundbreaking. There are these different authors that he's reading. It's interesting to see that he's reading other fantasy authors who aren't well known right now, that were at the time, but now have kind of fallen off the popular, out of popular imagination. But he says, that with this, there really seems to be a hunger for the sort of thing that he himself is doing, the way that he's presenting the fantastic. The fairy tale. He calls it the fairy tale, the adult fairy tale.
Right. Right. And so, so he says that he's noticing that there's kind of an itch that he has been scratching, that's broadly speaking with this. And so Lord of the Rings, really, it seems like, at least according to from his letters internally, that this is really doing something to kind of fan the flames of fairy tale as a genre that then kind of develops into fantasy literature. And then that's what kind of makes it possible to open doors and let other publishers take more risks on other fantasy literature because of the success of Lord of the Rings.
He gets to do a lap of honor, in a sense, because he's successful in his own time, and he's able to say, my instinct that there was, the conversation he had with C.S. Lewis, that they would write the things that no one else was writing because people weren't writing what they wanted to read, which is a very good reason for writing a book. And he's finding his audience, which is wonderful. Just to sort of move on to his discussion about film, there's a very interesting long letter, 210, which is a breakdown of the Zimmerman treatment of Lord of the Rings. That version doesn't get made, obviously, but it is interesting him seriously thinking through how would this story adapt, how would it break down. And I think he felt that quite often his intention was misunderstood, surprise, surprise, by the person who was trying to adapt it for a film treatment. And he's particularly interested in the misunderstanding of the power of the Black Riders, because he says their peril is most entirely due to the unreasoning fear that they inspire like ghosts. So trying to make something too concrete to, Lord knows what would have happened in a 60s treatment of this, but to sort of, not to miss out the emotional impact of what's going on there. I think we were quite fortunate that the film wasn't made. I
don't think that would have aged well.
I'm very pleased the Beatles one wasn't made. I mean, it would have been fun, but only a serious attempt, I think, would have been really quite tricky to like. I think.
Right. I feel like the Beatles adaptation probably would have focused an awful lot on Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil might have become the main character of Lord of the Rings in that adaptation, which
that's the other parallel.
A different film.
You know, we're talking about all these things where different routes were taken. That there is another thought experiment to think, well, what happens if the main? So I think now a lot of people approach Lord of the Rings from the films rather than the books. Sadly, do go and read the books if you haven't, folks. But at least they got a decent set of films to base it on. But what happens if it had been the Beatles had taken over and it become totally subsumed underneath their fame and fortune? It would have been a different universe, I think. So just to sort of wrap up, well, we've talked about his frustrations in academia, and then we've got his retirement, and he's still writing interesting letters in his retirement. He doesn't really ever stop, to be honest. He's writing right up to the moment that he dies, really. Very interesting letters. So I would say one of the favorite things I've read this year, possibly last few years, highly recommended, wonderful production. It's a lovely hardback book if you're wanting to treat yourself. Beautifully set out. So put it on the wish list as a birthday present. Highly recommended. So I'd give it 10 out of 10.
It's delightful. Yeah. And I think one of he mentions there that in one of the letters, 109, says a solitary art is no art. And so seeing these letters, like, you really kind of see him. He wasn't just completely isolated in his like creative life. He's willing to share these things and talk about it and discuss them with others. And these letters kind of show him in conversation, right? His work in conversation with other people. And so, yeah, absolutely. It really, it helps me appreciate Tolkien better, the world that he created, the thought that he put into that, and his relationality with other people, right? So he's is part of an ongoing conversation about art, about what is meaningful, and his kind of contribution to that, and how seriously he takes it, and responding to questions, concerns of other people. It is a real delight. Increase not only gives you all sorts of fun bits and pieces, additional information about characters in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and the broader legendarium, but also gives you this kind of double insight into the mind of Tolkien about this creator, his creative process, following him through that there, and his family relationship. You know, as a full, like you said earlier, Julia, as kind of like the rich tapestry of this person. You see him in kind of like all different kinds of lights. Really impressive, really inspiring, I think, from his kind of the takeaway at the end, that even at the very end of his life, he was still getting ideas for stories based on names from the Silmarillion. He's thinking about just the names. He's like, oh, here's another story. But he wanted to put it into readable form, but he realized that he was running out of time. So he wanted to at least hurry up and sketch out ideas of some of these for others to make use of. And so I think this has demonstrated, you know, how many people have been inspired by Lord of the Rings to write fantasy, to write sci-fi, to write anything at all. And so I think that was, a testament to his character and devotion to the craft of writing, that he could inspire so many other people in the way that he wrote. That others have got their start with Lord of the Rings to then go on to live wildly fulfilling creative lives, many of whom are probably listening to this right now.
So we're going to finish with our usual, wherein all the fantasy world is the best place for something, and we've chosen letter writing. But before we get there, it's worth hanging on to the end of this podcast, because I want to reveal one really shocking point that came up in the letters. I've got one. Have you got one that you've prepared?
I've got a couple. Yeah.
You've got to pick one. My most shocking fact that I learnt in letter 27 is that hobbits wear boots. He says, there is in the text no mention of him acquiring of boots. There should be. It has dropped out somehow or other in the various revisions. The bootings occurred at Rivendell, and he was again bootless after leaving Rivendell on the way home. And I'm just shocked. I'm sincerely shocked. I think perhaps maybe that was just Tolkien doesn't have to be entirely consistent, because he doesn't make any mention of the next round of people going through Rivendell putting on boots. But I just thought, oh my goodness, I can't imagine hobbits wearing shoes. Bootings. Maybe it was for the snow, because they go up the Misty Mountains, don't they? And with the dwarves, it's the Hobbit he's talking about, not the Lord of the Rings. So maybe it was special snowshoe boots or something. I don't know. What's your top?
To pick one was that just like made me smile was that Shadowfax went west to Valinor with Gandalf.
Yes.
Somebody asked about Shadowfax, and he says, I'm sure Gandalf would have taken him when he left, that he would have taken Shadowfax. And they said, Shadowfax got to go west. That's so great. Just imagining Shadowfax, such a great character. And then just to think of Shadowfax on a boat sailing, with the wind, the wind from Valinor just kind of blowing through his mane, just delighted me. So there's all sorts of little bits like this that are in there. So yeah, that was just really fun, surprising and delightful for me to come across.
Yeah. So moving away from these wonderful letters, Jacob, where do you think in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to write a letter?
I'm going to go with the wizarding world, specifically because it has the best variety of delivery methods for letters.
Yeah, I agree.
Different, right? So you have owl deliveries, which are just fun. Howlers, right? As if you're really upset with somebody and you need to get your point across. That's an effective mode for getting across certain points. Professor Umbridge's flesh writing. I don't know what. That one's a little bit painful, but it is variety. And then in the Fantastic Beasts, what was really fun, the film version, where you have these origami rats and memos that are folded into the shape of little rats and then kind of crawl through tubes. So kind of animated letters. So yeah, just lots of fun different ways to get your message to other people. I think the delivery method, that's kind of what I focused on. I think that would be fun.
That was going to be my pick as well, but I just suppose that whilst we've been talking about Tolkien, doesn't seem to be much of a postal service going on in Middle-earth, but there is in the Shire. And so that's not a bad place to be a write a letter and even be a postman or post person in the Shire, because it seems to involve walking around, dropping letters, agreeing to go to parties and thanking people for presents. So it seems quite not many tax demands amongst that, as far as I can make out. So, yes, I agree. Harry Potter has really done a very good job at making the letter fanciful. And, of course, your letter from Hogwarts is the moment. That is the great moment when your life changes. So, yeah, I agree with your pick. Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for talking about the letters with me. They are wonderful, everybody. So I hope that you'll rush off and enjoy a summer of reading Tolkien's letters. It's a nice long read and can be taken in stages, but they're highly recommended. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast. brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcentreforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now it's the final days of our Everything's on Sale event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses. Our Memorial Day event ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.